A broken-hearted widower paid just $12,000 for a crumbling castle buried in snow, thinking he was buying his children a fresh start. But what he found hidden beneath ancient stone floors would turn their struggle into the greatest treasure hunt in modern history. Before we explore this incredible journey, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The snow fell like forgotten prayers across the mountains of upstate New York, each flake carrying with it the weight of another sleepless night. Marcus Hartwell stood at the kitchen window of their cramped apartment, watching his breath fog the glass as his coffee went cold in his hands. It had been 8 months since Sarah died, and the world still felt like it was happening to someone else. Behind him, the sounds of morning chaos echoed through rooms that felt smaller every day. Emma, his 14-year-old daughter, argued with 9-year-old Jake about the last clean bowl, while 6-year-old Lily sat cross-legged on the couch, braiding her doll's hair with the same careful concentration Sarah used to braid hers. The apartment felt crowded with grief and unpaid bills and the suffocating weight of trying to be enough for 3 children when he could barely hold himself together. Marcus had been a software engineer before everything fell apart, before the medical bills, before the funeral costs, before he realized that life insurance doesn't cover the cost of a broken heart. Now he worked construction when he could find it, came home with sawdust in his hair and concrete under his nails, and lay awake at night calculating how much longer they could stretch the savings account that had once seemed so secure. The apartment lease was up in 6 weeks. The landlord had been patient, but patience had limits, especially when rent was 3 months behind. Marcus had applied for cheaper places, smaller places, but every application required proof of income he didn't have, references from jobs he'd lost, a stability that had died with his wife. Sarah had been the anchor of their family, the one who remembered permission slips and scheduled dentist appointments and knew exactly how to comfort each child when the world felt too heavy. She had hummed while she cooked dinner and read bedtime stories with voices for every character and made their small apartment feel like the safest place on earth. Without her, the space felt like a hotel room where they were all just temporary guests, waiting for someone to tell them it was time to leave. "Dad, the cereal's all soggy," Jake complained, pushing the bowl away with dramatic disgust. His dark hair stuck up in 3 different directions, and his dinosaur pajamas were already stained with milk. "Eat it anyway," Marcus said without turning around, his voice flat with exhaustion. "Food is food." "But Mom's not here." The words came out sharper than he intended, cutting through the room like broken glass. The silence that followed was immediate and heavy, the kind that made the air feel thick and hard to breathe. Marcus turned to see Jake's face crumple, his lower lip trembling in that way that always preceded tears. Lily's eyes filled with water, and she clutched her doll tighter. Emma's jaw clenched in that expression she'd perfected since the funeral, the one that said she was holding back angry words and disappointment and the weight of being 14 in a world that had stopped making sense. Marcus closed his eyes and counted to 5, feeling the familiar stab of guilt that accompanied every moment when his grief spilled over onto his children. They had lost their mother. They didn't need to lose their father to bitterness too. "I'm sorry," he said, walking over to ruffle Jake's hair. "I'm sorry, buddy. You're right. Mom would never make you eat soggy cereal." He managed a tired smile. "How about we grab some fresh stuff on the way to school?" Jake nodded, but the damage was done. The morning was fractured, like everything else these days. Trust, once broken, was hard to rebuild, especially when it kept breaking over and over again. Later, after dropping the kids at school with promises he hoped he could keep about dinner and homework help, Marcus sat in his rusted Honda Civic in the school parking lot and opened his laptop. The Wi-Fi from the nearby coffee shop was weak but free, and he'd been doing this every morning for 2 weeks, searching for miracles in real estate listings, looking for anything they could afford. He'd started with reasonable searches: 3-bedroom apartments within 50 miles, 2-bedroom houses with yards, fixer-uppers that might be manageable with some sweat equity and YouTube tutorials. But as the weeks passed and the options dwindled, his searches had become more desperate. Cabins in the middle of nowhere, foreclosed trailers, condemned houses that might be fixable if he had tools and time, and about $20,000 he didn't have. The laptop screen reflected his tired face back at him as he scrolled through listings that all seemed designed to remind him of everything he couldn't provide for his children. Houses with actual heating systems, places with more than one bathroom, homes where families could spread out instead of stepping on each other's grief. That's when he saw it. The listing was buried on page 7 of a search that had started with Cheap Homes New York and had devolved into desperate prayer. The photo was grainy, taken in poor light, but unmistakable. A massive stone structure rising from snow-covered grounds, like something from Emma's fantasy novels. The headline read, "Historic Castle Estate, Motivated Seller, $12,000 OBO." Marcus stared at the screen, certain his eyes were playing tricks on him. $12,000 for a castle? It had to be a mistake, a typo, a cruel joke played by the universe on desperate fathers. Had stopped believing in good news. He clicked through to the full listing, his heart hammering, as if he'd discovered buried treasure. The description was sparse. 17th-century stone structure on 14 acres. Needs significant work, but structurally sound. Owner motivated for quick sale. Serious inquiries only. The photos were few and blurry, but they showed soaring stone walls that seemed to stretch toward heaven, arched doorways that could accommodate giants, and a main hall with a ceiling that disappeared into shadows. It looked like something from the stories Sarah used to tell the children before bed, the kind of place where magic was real and broken things could be made whole again. Marcus scrolled down to the contact information, his hands shaking slightly. The listing agent was in a town called Millfield, about 2 hours north. He'd never heard of it, but that didn't surprise him. He'd never had reason to look for castles before. His phone rang, the harsh sound cutting through his concentration like a blade. The construction site. "Marcus? It's Tony. Listen, I got some bad news. The Robertson job got cancelled, something about permits. I don't have anything else lined up for at least 2 weeks." Marcus closed his eyes and pressed his forehead against the steering wheel, feeling the familiar weight of financial panic settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. 2 weeks without work meant 2 weeks without pay, meant the landlord's patience would finally run out, meant his children would be homeless because their father couldn't figure out how to keep them safe. "You still there, Marcus?" Yeah, I'm here. Thanks for letting me know." He hung up and stared at the castle listing again. $12,000. He had exactly $11,734 left in his savings account, the last of Sarah's life insurance money that was supposed to be the buffer between his children and complete disaster. He shouldn't even consider it. It was insane. Castles didn't sell for $12,000 unless they were about to fall down, or haunted, or sitting on contaminated land, probably all three. A rational man would close the laptop and figure out how to stretch unemployment benefits and food stamps until the next construction job materialized. But Marcus hadn't felt rational since the doctor walked into that hospital waiting room 8 months ago and changed everything with 5 words. "We did everything we could." He dialed the number. "Millfield Realty, this is Janet speaking. Hi, I'm calling about the castle listing, the one for $12,000. A pause. "Oh, that one. Are you serious about it?" The question caught Marcus off guard. "I think so. What's wrong with it?" Another pause, longer this time. "Well, it's been on the market for 3 years. Beautiful property, don't get me wrong, but it's isolated and big. Really big. Most people take one look and run the other way." Marcus thought about his children cramped in their small apartment, about Emma, who had stopped reading fantasy novels because they reminded her too much of bedtime stories, about Jake, who hadn't built a fort since his mother died, about Lily, who still asked when Mommy was coming home. "Can I see it today? Today? It's supposed to snow again. I can drive in snow." Janet sighed, the sound carrying decades of dealing with unrealistic clients and impossible properties. Let me call the caretaker and see if he can meet us up there. It's about an hour from town, up a mountain road that's not exactly maintained. You sure about this? Marcus looked at the photo again, at stone walls thick enough to keep out the cold and rooms large enough that grief might finally have space to breathe. He thought about 14 acres where his children could run and shout and be young instead of careful, where they could build forts and explore and remember how to believe in possibilities. I'm sure. The drive north took Marcus through country that grew more remote with each mile. Towns became villages, villages became crossroads, crossroads became nothing but forest and snow, and the occasional mailbox marking driveways that disappeared into the trees. The Honda's heater struggled against the cold, seeping through windows that didn't quite seal. And Marcus found himself thinking about Sarah, the way he always did when the silence got too thick. She would have loved this drive. Sarah had grown up in the city but dreamed of countryside, of gardens and apple trees, and children who learned to build forts from fallen branches instead of apps on their phones. They'd talked about moving someday, when the kids were older, when work was more flexible, when there was time to plan and save and choose carefully. But someday had been stolen from them by cells that multiplied in darkness, by treatments that bought weeks instead of years, by a universe that didn't care about plans or dreams or the way Sarah hummed while she braided Lily's hair. Marcus gripped the steering wheel tighter and focused on the road, on the snow that fell heavier now, on the GPS that insisted he was heading toward something called Millfield, even though he hadn't seen a building in 20 minutes. Millfield turned out to be 3 blocks of weathered storefronts, clustered around a gas station that sold coffee from a machine that looked older than Marcus. The whole town felt like something that had been forgotten by progress and left to survive on stubbornness and habit. Janet was waiting for him in a burgundy sedan, a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and the kind of practical winter coat that spoke of many seasons spent showing properties to people who weren't really serious about buying. She climbed out when she saw him approaching, her breath visible in the cold air. "You must be Marcus," she said, extending a gloved hand. "I have to warn you, the road up to the castle is challenging. We'll take my car. It's got chains." The mountain road was barely more than a dirt track that wound through forest so thick the snow seemed to fall upward from the branches. They climbed steadily, the sedan's engine straining, past trees that looked like they'd been growing since before America was discovered. Marcus began to wonder if they'd somehow driven off the edge of the world into some parallel place where castles could actually cost $12,000. The woods grew deeper and darker as they climbed, until Marcus felt like they were driving through the pages of a fairy tale. Ancient pines pressed close to the narrow road, their branches heavy with snow that muffled every sound except the sedan's laboring engine. No power lines, no cell towers, no signs of civilization except the road itself, which looked like it had been carved into the mountain by hand decades ago. Then the trees parted, and Marcus saw it. The castle rose from the mountainside like something carved from winter itself. Stone walls, the color of storm clouds, stretched impossibly high, punctuated by narrow windows that gleamed black as ice. Towers spiraled into the gray sky, their peaks lost in low-hanging clouds that seemed to crown the structure with moving mist. Snow had drifted against the massive wooden doors and covered what might once have been gardens, but the building itself stood solid and proud, as if it had been waiting centuries for this moment. "Holy," Marcus caught himself before the profanity escaped fully. "It's huge. 37 rooms," Janet said, pulling up to what had once been a circular driveway, including a main hall that's bigger than most people's houses. Built in 1868 by some railroad baron who apparently had more money than sense. They sat in the car for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled, windshield wipers struggling against snow that fell harder now. The castle loomed before them, and Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in 8 months: wonder. It was impossible and beautiful and completely impractical. The kind of place where stories happened, where ordinary people discovered they were capable of extraordinary things. The kind of place Sarah would have loved, where she would have spun tales about brave knights and hidden treasures while the children listened with wide eyes. "What's the catch?" Marcus asked, his voice barely audible over the wind that howled around the car. "There has to be a catch." Janet turned off the engine and sighed, her breath fogging in the sudden cold. The heating system was installed sometime around 1920 and hasn't been updated since. The plumbing is temperamental. There's no cell phone service for about 10 miles in any direction. The roof leaks in at least 3 places that we know of. And the previous owner died intestate, which means the state just wants it gone. Marcus stared at the castle, trying to calculate heating bills for a structure that size, trying to imagine maintaining plumbing in a building that was older than his great-grandfather. It was madness, complete madness. "That's it?" "Well," Janet said, gathering her purse and preparing to brave the cold, "there are the stories." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Stories? Local folklore. People say strange things happen up here. Lights in windows when the place is supposed to be empty. Sounds that don't make sense. The usual nonsense that grows up around old places." Janet shrugged, but her expression suggested she took the stories more seriously than her words implied. "Personally, I think people just aren't comfortable with that much history in one place. Makes them nervous." A figure emerged from what might have been a caretaker's cottage tucked behind the main structure. He was tall and thin, with white hair and the kind of weathered face that came from decades of mountain winters. He waved and approached their car, moving through the snow with the easy confidence of someone who belonged in this wild place. "That's Harold," Janet said. "He's been looking after the place since old Mr. Blackwood died 5 years ago, refused to let the state board it up. Said it deserved better than that." Harold rapped gently on the passenger window, and Janet rolled it down, letting in air so cold it made Marcus's lungs ache. "Afternoon, Mrs. Peterson. This the fellow interested in the castle?" His voice carried the slow cadence of mountain people, unhurried and thoughtful. But his eyes, pale blue and sharp, studied Marcus with an intensity that suggested he was evaluating more than just another potential buyer. "Harold, meet Marcus. Marcus. Harold knows every inch of this place." Harold studied Marcus for a long moment, taking in the worry lines around his eyes, the cheap winter coat, the way his hands gripped the door handle, like he was preparing to run. "You got children, son?" The question caught Marcus off guard, too personal for a first meeting. "3 of them." "Why?" Harold smiled, the first warmth Marcus had felt all day. "Because this place was built for children. All those stairs and secret passages and rooms perfect for hiding. Been too quiet for too long." They spent the next 2 hours walking through rooms that seemed to stretch on forever. The main hall was indeed bigger than most houses, with a fireplace large enough to roast an entire deer and windows that looked out over valleys Marcus hadn't known existed. Light streamed through stained glass that painted rainbow patterns on stone floors, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. The kitchen was a cavern of stone and iron, with a wood-burning stove that Harold demonstrated with obvious pride, and pride that suggested long practice. Copper pots hung from hooks that looked hand-forged, and pantry shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, designed to feed an army, or at least a very large family. Bedrooms branched off corridors that seemed to wind through the mountain itself, each one unique, each one possessing a character that felt almost alive. Some had fireplaces with carved mantels that told stories in stone. Others had window seats, perfect for reading or dreaming. All of them had ceilings high enough to make a child feel like royalty, and walls thick enough to keep out any cold or fear or sadness the world might offer. The previous owner, Mr. Blackwood, he lived here alone for 40 years, Harold explained as they climbed a spiral staircase to one of the towers. Bit of an eccentric, but he loved this place. Spent every penny he had keeping it up, making improvements, adding his own touches. "What kind of touches?" Marcus asked, slightly out of breath from the climb. The tower stairs seemed to go on forever, circling upward through stone walls that grew thicker as they ascended. Harold paused at a landing and gestured to what looked like a blank stone wall. He pressed against a section of rock, and it swung inward to reveal a narrow passage that disappeared into darkness. He was fascinated by the original architecture, spent years studying old blueprints, exploring every corner. Said he found things the original builders never intended to leave behind. The passage led to a library that took Marcus's breath away. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, filled with leather-bound volumes, stretched in every direction, creating intimate reading nooks and cozy alcoves. Comfortable chairs were arranged around another massive fireplace, while windows looked out over snow-covered peaks that seemed to go on forever. It was the kind of room Sarah would have claimed as her own, where she would have curled up with tea and stories while snow fell outside like scenes from the novels she loved. The wiring's been updated in most of the main rooms, Harold continued, as they made their way back to the central areas. Blackwood was meticulous about that. Plumbing, too, though it can be temperamental on the coldest days. The heating system's old but functional, as long as you know how to work with it instead of against it. They ended the tour in the main hall, where afternoon light filtered through stained glass windows and painted jeweled patterns across stone floors. Marcus stood in the center of the space and turned slowly, trying to absorb the impossibility of it all. The ceiling disappeared into shadows high above. Tapestries that looked genuinely medieval hung from stone walls. A fireplace dominated one entire wall, its opening large enough for Marcus to stand inside without ducking. "What do you think?" Janet asked, her voice echoing in the vast space. Marcus thought about the cramped apartment, where grief felt like a fourth family member they couldn't afford to feed. He thought about Emma, who'd stopped reading fantasy novels because they reminded her too much of the bedtime stories Sarah used to tell. He thought about Jake, who hadn't built a fort since his mother died, and Lily, who still asked when Mommy was coming home. He thought about Sarah's dreams of apple trees and gardens and children who learned to find magic in the world around them instead of disappointment. He thought about the $11,734 in his savings account and the impossibility of finding anything else they could afford. "I'll take it," he said. The paperwork took 3 days to complete, 3 days during which Marcus lay awake at night, wondering if he'd finally lost his mind completely. He sold the Honda to a used car dealer who paid cash and didn't ask questions, borrowed money from his brother-in-law to cover the difference, and signed documents that transferred ownership of a castle to a man who'd been living paycheck to paycheck for 8 months. His brother-in-law thought he was having a breakdown. His landlord thought he was lying. His children thought he was finally doing something interesting for the first time since their mother died. "Are we really going to live in a castle?" Jake asked for the 20th time as they loaded their possessions into a rented U-Haul truck. "We're really going to live in a castle," Marcus confirmed, though he still couldn't quite believe it himself. "Is it going to be cold?" "Probably, but we'll have fires in the fireplaces, and thick blankets, and hot chocolate whenever you want it. Can I have my own tower room?" Emma pulled out one earbud and turned to glare at her little brother. "It's not Disneyland, Jake. It's just an old house that happens to be shaped like a castle. And it's probably haunted and definitely freezing, and we'll probably all die of pneumonia before Christmas. But Dad says a lot of things." Emma's voice carried the weight of 8 months of disappointment and broken promises. "He said Mom was going to get better too." Marcus caught Emma's eye in the rearview mirror, seeing accusation there that cut deeper than any knife. "Just another promise you probably can't keep," her expression said. "Just another way you're trying to fix things that can't be fixed." Maybe she was right. Maybe this was just another mistake in a year full of them, another way to disappoint children who had already lost too much. But as the U-Haul climbed the mountain road and the trees gave way to reveal stone walls and spiraling towers rising from the snow, Marcus felt something he'd almost forgotten. Hope. On a Thursday morning in late November, with snow falling like benediction and his children's voices echoing with wonder instead of grief, Marcus Hartwell drove through the massive wooden doors of his impossible home and began the next chapter of their story. The castle looked different as their new residence than it had during the tour, larger somehow, more imposing. Snow had drifted higher against the doors, and icicles hung from the gutters like crystal teeth. But smoke rose from the chimney of Harold's cottage, and warm yellow light glowed in the main hall windows, evidence that someone was waiting for them. Harold emerged from the cottage before Marcus could even turn off the engine, his arms full of split firewood. He waved and approached the truck, his breath visible in the cold air like small prayers. "Welcome home," he said as Marcus climbed out of the driver's seat. "I've got fires going in the main hall and the kitchen, and I stocked the pantry with basics. Figured you'd want to get settled before you worried about grocery runs." Marcus felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. Kindness from strangers had become rare since Sarah's death, and he'd forgotten how it could catch you off guard, how it could make you remember that the world still held good people doing good things without being asked. The children tumbled out of the truck, and Marcus watched their faces as they got their first real look at their new home. Jake ran immediately to the massive wooden doors, trying to push them open with his small hands. Lily stood perfectly still, clutching her doll, overwhelmed by the sheer size of everything around her. Emma hung back, arms crossed, but Marcus could see wonder fighting with skepticism in her expression. "The doors are heavy," Harold told Jake with a grin. "Here, let me help you." The doors swung open to reveal the main hall in all its impossible glory. Stone walls stretching up to vaulted ceilings lost in shadow. A fire crackling in the enormous fireplace. Afternoon light streaming through stained glass windows and painting everything in jewel tones. The children stepped inside hesitantly, as if they were entering a church or museum instead of their new home. "This is where we're going to live," Lily whispered, her voice small in the vast space. "This is where we're going to live," Marcus confirmed, his own voice catching slightly. For the first time since Sarah's funeral, Emma smiled. Really smiled, the kind that reached her eyes and reminded Marcus of the girl she'd been before grief carved lines into her 14-year-old face. For just a moment, she looked like a child again, instead of a teenager carrying burdens too heavy for her age. "Can we explore?" Jake asked, already bouncing on his toes with excitement. "After we unload the truck," Marcus said, "and after Harold shows us how everything works. This isn't exactly like a regular house." The next few hours blurred together. Boxes carried through doors that could have accommodated a parade, children's voices echoing off stone walls for the first time in months. Harold patiently explaining the quirks of a heating system that required more ritual than science. Marcus found himself caught between the practical demands of moving day and the surreal reality that he was unpacking his children's clothes in rooms that had probably housed nobility and servants and maybe even royalty. Emma claimed a tower room with windows that looked out over the forest, her eyes bright with possibilities as she imagined arranging her books and art supplies in a space that felt like it belonged in a story. Jake chose a bedroom on the second floor that connected to another room by a narrow passage hidden behind a bookshelf, his architect's mind already planning elaborate games and adventures. Lily wanted to stay close to her father, so she took the room next to his, a cozy space with a window seat perfect for reading and a fireplace that Harold promised to teach her how to tend safely. By evening, they'd managed to create small islands of familiarity in the vast sea of stone and shadow, Emma's books arranged on ancient shelves, Jake's toy trucks lined up on windowsills wide enough to hold entire cities, Lily's stuffed animals arranged carefully on her new bed. Marcus made dinner on the wood-burning stove under Harold's patient tutelage, and they ate by firelight, at a table that could have seated 20, but felt intimate with just the four of them. "Dad?" Jake said, as they finished the simple meal of pasta and canned sauce that somehow tasted better in their new home. "Yeah, buddy? I think Mom would like this place." Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the way grief could still ambush him in moments that should have been purely happy. But for the first time, the pain was mixed with something else, peace, maybe, or the beginning of it. "I think she would too," he said softly. That night, after the children had been tucked into beds that dwarfed them, after Harold had banked the fires and headed back to his cottage with promises to return in the morning, Marcus walked alone through the vast halls of his impossible home. His footsteps echoed off stone walls, and shadows danced in corners that seemed to stretch beyond the reach of any light source. It was quiet, in a way their apartment had never been quiet, the kind of deep silence that came from thick walls and distance from any other human habitation. But it wasn't empty silence. The castle felt alive somehow, as if the stones themselves held memories of all the lives that had unfolded within these stone walls. Marcus found himself drawn to the library, where embers still glowed in the fireplace, and moonlight silvered the snow visible through tall windows. He sank into one of the leather chairs, its surface worn smooth by decades of use, and allowed himself, for the first time in 8 months, to fully absorb where he was and what he'd done. He'd bought a castle, with money he couldn't afford to spend, in a place he'd never been, for reasons he couldn't entirely explain even to himself. He'd uprooted his grieving children and moved them to the middle of nowhere, to a building that required maintenance he didn't know how to provide, in weather that could isolate them for days at a time. It was completely insane. And yet, as he sat in that ancient room surrounded by centuries of accumulated wisdom, listening to wind whistle through towers and snow tap against windows like gentle fingers, Marcus felt something he'd lost the day Sarah died, the possibility that tomorrow might be better than today. But as he prepared to head upstairs to his own bed, something caught his attention, a sound, faint but distinct, coming from somewhere deep in the castle, like footsteps, but not quite. Like voices, but too distant to understand. Like secrets stirring in the depths of stone walls that held more than memories. Marcus paused at the foot of the grand staircase, listening. The sound came again, definitely from below, from levels of the castle he hadn't yet explored. Harold had mentioned basement areas, storage rooms, mechanical spaces. But this didn't sound mechanical, it sounded human. Marcus grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and made his way toward the narrow stairs Harold had pointed out earlier, stairs that led down into the foundations of the castle. The stone steps were worn smooth by centuries of use, and the air grew noticeably colder as he descended. The basement was a maze of corridors and chambers that seemed to extend far beyond the footprint of the castle above. Some rooms held the detritus of decades, broken furniture, boxes of documents, wine racks empty for so long they'd become architectural features. But other areas felt different, maintained, as if someone had been caring for them recently. In what appeared to be a former wine cellar, Marcus found evidence that his new home held more secrets than Harold had mentioned. Fresh footprints in the dust, tools that showed signs of recent use, and maps, detailed architectural drawings of the castle that showed levels and passages Marcus hadn't seen, areas that seemed to exist in spaces he couldn't account for. The sound came again, closer now, and Marcus realized he wasn't alone in the depths of his new home. Someone else was down here, moving through passages he didn't know existed, for purposes he couldn't imagine. Marcus turned off his flashlight and listened, his heart hammering in the darkness. Footsteps echoed through stone corridors, measured and confident, the gait of someone familiar with these hidden spaces. The castle, it seemed, harbored more than memories in its ancient walls. And Marcus was about to discover that buying a home for $12,000 sometimes meant inheriting secrets that were worth far more than money and far more dangerous than he could imagine. Winter settled over the castle like a heavy blanket, and with it came a rhythm Marcus had never experienced before. Days measured not by traffic and deadlines, but by the needs of ancient fireplaces and the whims of a heating system that Harold described as temperamental but trustworthy. Like an old friend with strong opinions, the children adapted faster than Marcus expected, their voices growing confident as they claimed territories within the vast stone walls. Emma had turned her tower room into a sanctuary of books and sketches, spending hours at her window drawing the forest below and filling notebooks with stories that grew more elaborate each day. The isolation that had worried Marcus seemed to feed her creativity, instead of stifling it. Jake had discovered that sound traveled through the castle in mysterious ways, allowing him to whisper into a heating vent in his room and be heard clearly in the kitchen 3 floors down. He'd mapped these acoustic corridors with the dedication of a scientist, creating elaborate communication systems that let him talk to his sisters without leaving his bed. Lily had befriended every fireplace in the building, naming them and insisting on helping Harold with the daily ritual of banking coals and arranging kindling. She called the main hall fireplace George because it was big and important, while the smaller one in the library was Rosie because it crackled in a friendly way. But it was Marcus who noticed the inconsistencies first. It started with rooms that didn't quite fit the architecture he could see from outside. The library, for instance, was larger inside than it appeared from the corridor, not by much, but enough to make him pause and count steps, to measure distances with his eyes, and find them wanting. The main staircase seemed to have an extra landing that didn't correspond to any floor plan Harold could show him. And there were drafts that came from places where there shouldn't be any openings, cool currents of air that suggested spaces beyond the visible walls. The original builders were ambitious. Harold explained one morning as they stood in the main hall, sharing coffee before the children woke. Steam rose from their mugs in the cold air, and morning light filtered through stained glass windows in jeweled patterns. Built this place to last centuries, with all the quirks that come from that kind of thinking. Marcus gestured toward the eastern wall, where he'd noticed a section of stone that looked subtly different from the rest, the same color and texture, but with mortar lines that didn't quite match the pattern elsewhere. "Harold, does this wall look odd to you?" Harold followed his gaze, and something shifted in his expression, a flicker of unease that was quickly hidden behind another sip of coffee. Stonework from different periods. Mr. Blackwood was always finding sections that had been repaired or modified over the years. Modified? How? Well, castles weren't exactly built to modern standards. Previous owners made changes, added conveniences, updated things for their own needs. Harold shrugged, but the gesture seemed forced. This place has had a lot of owners over the years. Each one left their mark. Marcus studied the wall more carefully, running his fingers along the mortar lines. The stone felt different here too, not just visually but tactily. Smoother, as if it had been handled more recently than the surrounding masonry. That afternoon, while the children were occupied with a massive jigsaw puzzle of medieval tapestries in the library, Marcus began his own systematic exploration of the castle. He'd thought he'd seen most of it during Harold's initial tour, but now he realized how much he'd missed, how many corridors and chambers there were to discover. He started with the areas he used daily, measuring rooms with careful steps and comparing them to what he could observe from outside. The discrepancies were subtle but consistent: interior spaces that seemed larger than their exterior dimensions should allow, corridors that curved in ways that didn't match the building's visible footprint. The kitchen was particularly puzzling. From outside, the castle's eastern wing appeared to be a simple rectangular structure. But inside, the kitchen extended back into what should have been solid mountain stone, with pantries and storage areas that seemed to tunnel directly into the rock face. "Dad, what are you doing?" Emma asked, finding him on his hands and knees in the kitchen pantry, tapping stones and listening to the sound they made. "Just checking something," Marcus said, not wanting to worry her with talk of architectural anomalies, making sure everything's solid. Emma raised an eyebrow in that way that said she wasn't buying his explanation but was willing to let it slide for now. "Harold's teaching Lily how to bank the fires properly. She's very serious about it." Marcus smiled, grateful that his youngest was finding purpose in their strange new home. "Good. We need all the help we can get, keeping this place warm." But after Emma left, Marcus continued his investigation with renewed intensity. The pantry walls definitely extended further into the mountain than should have been possible. And when he pressed his ear to the back wall, he could swear he heard air moving on the other side. The basement levels were where the mysteries deepened. Harold had shown them the main areas during their tour: the wine cellar, the mechanical rooms, the storage areas filled with decades of accumulated belongings from previous owners. But as Marcus explored more systematically, he found passages that led to chambers Harold hadn't mentioned, spaces that seemed to exist in architectural limbo. One corridor, accessed through a door he'd initially assumed was a closet, led to a series of rooms that had clearly been used recently. The floors were cleaner than they should have been, the air fresher. Tools hung on pegboards with the kind of organization that spoke of regular use. And on a workbench in what appeared to be a workshop, Marcus found something that made his pulse quicken: architectural drawings of the castle that showed levels and passages he'd never seen. The drawings were detailed and professional, marked with measurements and annotations in precise handwriting. They showed the castle as he knew it, but also revealed sections that seemed to exist in spaces he couldn't account for. Hidden passages that ran between the walls. Chambers that extended deep into the mountain. A whole secondary architecture that lived alongside the visible structure like a secret twin. Marcus studied the drawings for a long time, tracing the lines with his finger and trying to reconcile what he was seeing with the layout he'd memorized through weeks of living in the building. According to these plans, there was an entire section of the castle that simply didn't exist in the version he'd been shown, rooms and corridors that had been sealed away or hidden so completely that even careful exploration had missed them. He folded the most relevant drawing and slipped it into his pocket, then continued his investigation with a growing sense that he was living in a building that harbored more secrets than he'd ever imagined. The mechanical room housed the heating system Harold had described, decades old, but maintained with obsessive care. Every pipe had been cleaned and labeled, every connection checked and rechecked. But here too Marcus found inconsistencies, supply lines that led into walls and didn't emerge where they should, return ducts that seemed to service areas larger than the rooms he knew existed. It was Jake who provided the next major clue, though he didn't realize the significance of what he'd found. "Dad, there's something weird about my closet," he announced at dinner one evening, attacking his meatloaf with the enthusiasm of a 9-year-old who'd spent the day exploring. "Weird how?" Marcus asked, though his attention was divided between Jake's story and watching Emma help Lily cut her meat into precise, tiny pieces. "Well, it's really deep, like it goes way back into the wall, but when I go to the very back corner, I can feel air moving. Like there's a window open somewhere, but there's no window in my closet." Emma rolled her eyes with the practiced disdain of a 14-year-old. "It's probably just the heating system, dummy. Dad said the ducts go everywhere, but it's not warm air." Jake protested. "It's cold, and it smells different. Like, I don't know, like the basement, but not exactly, like somewhere old that nobody goes." Marcus set down his fork, suddenly giving Jake his full attention. "Show me after dinner." Jake's bedroom was one of the cozier spaces in the castle, with a fireplace that kept it consistently warm and windows that looked out over the forest. The room felt safe and ordinary, which made what Jake showed him all the more startling. The closet was indeed deep, extending back into the stone wall farther than seemed necessary for a bedroom wardrobe. Marcus followed his son to the back corner, where Jake stopped and pointed to a gap near the floor. "Right here, put your hand down there." Marcus knelt and felt along the floor where Jake indicated. There was definitely air movement, a cool draft coming from what appeared to be a gap between the floorboards and the back wall. But as he examined the space more carefully, he realized the gap wasn't an oversight. It was intentional, designed to allow airflow while remaining nearly invisible to casual observation. "Jake, have you told anyone else about this?" "Just Emma, but she said I was being dumb." "You're not being dumb. This is actually very interesting. But let's keep it between us for now, okay? I want to figure out what's going on before we get everyone excited." Jake's eyes widened with the thrill of sharing a secret with his father. "Is it like a mystery?" It might be exactly like a mystery. That night, after the children were asleep, Marcus returned to Jake's closet with a flashlight and a screwdriver. The gap at the back wall was too narrow to see through, but when he pressed against the stones surrounding it, One section felt different from the rest, slightly hollow, as if there was space behind it. He worked carefully, not wanting to damage anything but needing to understand what he was dealing with. The stone that felt different was actually a cleverly disguised panel, held in place by a mechanism so subtle that it would be invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. After an hour of patient exploration, Marcus found what he was looking for. Pressure applied in just the right combination of places caused the stone to slide inward, revealing a narrow opening barely large enough for a person to crawl through. Marcus stared at the opening for a long time, weighing caution against curiosity. He thought about Harold's explanations of the castle's modifications over the years, about the architectural drawings that showed spaces that shouldn't exist. He thought about his children sleeping peacefully in their beds, trusting their father to keep them safe in their strange new home. But he also thought about the impossibly low price he'd paid for this castle, about the sounds he'd heard that first night, about the feeling that he'd stumbled into something much larger than a simple real estate transaction. Marcus took a deep breath and squeezed through the opening. The space beyond was not what he expected. Instead of a cramped cavity or forgotten storage area, he found himself in a corridor that stretched away into darkness in both directions. The walls were finished stone, not rough castle foundation, and the floor was level and smooth. This wasn't an accidental void or forgotten maintenance space. This was architecture, deliberate and sophisticated. Marcus chose a direction at random and began walking, his flashlight beam revealing a passage that curved gently to follow the contours of the castle walls. The air was cool and dry, with a faint mineral scent that spoke of deep places and old stone. After perhaps 50 feet, he came to an intersection where 3 corridors met. Each passage looked identical, disappearing into darkness that his light couldn't penetrate. He was about to turn back when he noticed something that made his pulse quicken. Footprints in the dust. Not his own, he'd been careful to step lightly, but the clear impression of work boots, recent enough that the edges were still sharp. Someone else had been in these passages, and not long ago. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool air moving through the hidden corridors. He was alone in an unfamiliar space that by all rights shouldn't exist, following footprints left by someone who might still be nearby. In a building where he'd assumed his family was the only occupants besides Harold. But instead of retreating, Marcus found himself moving forward. Sarah had always said he had more curiosity than sense, and 8 months of grief hadn't changed that fundamental part of his character. He followed the footprints deeper into the maze of passages, his flashlight beam dancing off stone walls that seemed to absorb both light and sound. The corridor began to slope downward, descending gradually into what must be the mountain itself. The air grew noticeably colder, and Marcus could hear water dripping somewhere in the distance. The footprints continued ahead of him, clear and purposeful, as if their maker had been walking these paths for years. After what felt like 10 minutes, but might have been much longer, the passage opened into a space so large that Marcus's flashlight couldn't reach the walls or ceiling. He stood at what appeared to be the entrance to a vast underground chamber, carved directly from the living rock of the mountain. Marcus stepped carefully into the space, sweeping his beam in slow arcs to map the dimensions. What he saw made him stop breathing. The chamber was enormous, easily the size of the castle's main hall, but carved entirely from natural stone. Stalactites hung from a ceiling lost in shadows, while mineral deposits created columns and formations that would have impressed cathedral architects. But most impressive were the artificial elements, electrical conduits running along the walls, industrial lighting fixtures hanging dormant from the stone ceiling, and what appeared to be climate control equipment humming quietly in distant alcoves. This wasn't a natural cave. This was an installation, a purposeful excavation that had been equipped with modern conveniences and maintained by someone with significant resources. Marcus moved deeper into the chamber, his light revealing details that only added to the mystery. The floor had been leveled and sealed, creating a surface suitable for heavy equipment or storage. Alcoves had been carved into the walls at regular intervals, each one fitted with electrical outlets and what appeared to be environmental monitoring equipment. What happens next will uncover secrets hidden for decades, reveal the true purpose of this underground complex, and transform Marcus's understanding of what he's actually purchased. Stay tuned to see what lies deeper in these tunnels. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. But it was the far end of the chamber that captured Marcus's attention completely. There, illuminated by his wandering flashlight beam, stood massive steel doors set directly into the mountain stone. The doors were modern, institutional, with heavy-duty locks and what appeared to be electronic access controls. Marcus approached the doors cautiously, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. Up close, he could see that they were more than just barriers. They were vault doors, the kind used to protect things of extraordinary value. Warning placards in multiple languages covered their surface, and sophisticated environmental monitoring equipment surrounded the entrance. Whatever lay beyond those doors was important enough to justify an underground installation that must have cost millions of dollars to create. Important enough to hide beneath a castle sold for $12,000 to an unsuspecting buyer. Important enough that someone was still maintaining and monitoring it years after its creation. Marcus tried the handles, knowing they would be locked but unable to resist the attempt. The doors were indeed secured, but the electronic access panel beside them showed a green light that indicated the system was active and operational. Someone had been here recently. Someone with access codes and authorization. Someone who expected to return. Marcus turned away from the vault doors and began a more systematic exploration of the chamber, looking for clues about its purpose and the identity of whoever had created it. Near what appeared to be a monitoring station, he found a clipboard with maintenance logs dating back several years. The entries were brief and technical, recording temperature readings, humidity levels, and security system checks. But it was the signature at the bottom of each entry that made Marcus's blood run cold. H. Stevens, Harold. Marcus stared at the signature for a long time, trying to process what he was seeing. The man who had shown him through the castle, who had helped him settle his family, who had presented himself as a simple caretaker, had been maintaining this sophisticated underground installation for years. The sound of footsteps echoing through the stone passages behind him made Marcus realize he was no longer alone. Someone was approaching through the tunnels, moving with the confidence of familiar territory. Marcus switched off his flashlight and crouched behind a natural stone formation. His heart hammering so loudly he was sure it would give away his position. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the beam of another flashlight sweeping across the chamber walls. "I know you're in here." A voice called softly, the words echoing off stone walls. "No point in hiding. We need to talk." Marcus recognized the voice, and his blood turned to ice. It was Harold. Marcus remained motionless behind the stone formation, his mind racing as Harold's footsteps echoed through the vast chamber. The beam of the older man's flashlight swept methodically across the space, and Marcus realized that his desperate attempt at concealment was probably futile. Harold knew these passages well enough to navigate them in the dark. He would certainly know all the hiding places. "Marcus," Harold called again, his voice carrying a note of weary resignation that seemed to echo off the stone walls. "I saw the light from Jake's room when you opened the passage. Been wondering how long it would take you to find this place." Marcus forced himself to stand and step into the open, his own flashlight held ready but not threatening. In the harsh intersection of their two light beams, Harold looked older than his years, his weathered face lined with something deeper than age, something that looked like the weight of long-carried secrets. "How long have you known about this?" Marcus asked, his voice echoing in the vast space. "About the passages? Since the day Mr. Blackwood showed them to me, about 6 months before he died. Before that, I just knew he was up to something down here." Harold's expression was unreadable in the flashlight glare. "After he showed me, I understood why he'd been so secretive. And you've been maintaining it." Harold nodded slowly, lowering his flashlight in a gesture that seemed to invite honesty rather than confrontation. "Someone had to, Mr. Blackwood spent 40 years building this, and he died before he could finish what he started." Marcus gestured toward the vault doors, their steel surfaces gleaming in the dim light. "What's behind those doors, Harold?" "That," Harold said quietly, "is going to take some explaining. And Marcus, before I tell you anything more, you need to understand something important. What you found here isn't just about you anymore. It's bigger than this castle, bigger than your family, bigger than anything you've probably ever been involved with." The weight in Harold's voice made Marcus feel like he was standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down into an abyss whose bottom he couldn't see. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that when you bought this castle for $12,000, you didn't just buy a building, you bought responsibility for something that could change your life completely or destroy it, depending on how you handle what comes next." Harold moved toward a section of the chamber where folding chairs had been set up near what appeared to be a communication station. Electronic equipment hummed quietly on a table that had been carved directly from the mountain stone, and multiple screens showed readouts that Marcus couldn't interpret. "Sit down," Harold said, settling into one of the chairs with the careful movements of someone whose joints had been stiffened by too many mountain winters. "This is going to take a while, and you're going to need time to process what I'm about to tell you." Marcus remained standing, every instinct telling him to run, to get back to his children, to pretend he'd never found the hidden passage in Jake's closet. But curiosity and something deeper, a recognition that his life had already changed irrevocably the moment he'd stepped into these tunnels, kept him rooted in place. "Who are you? Really, Harold?" The older man smiled sadly, as if he'd been waiting years for someone to ask that question. "My name is Harold Stevens, and until 5 years ago, I was a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specializing in art theft and cultural property crimes." Marcus felt the ground seem to shift beneath his feet. "FBI, 32 years with the Bureau. I was assigned to investigate reports of suspicious activity at this location about 7 years ago. Someone had reported unusual shipments being delivered to a castle in the mountains, vehicles coming and going at odd hours, modifications being made to a building that was supposed to be a private residence." Harold paused, studying Marcus's face in the dim light. "I came here expecting to find a smuggling operation, or maybe a private collector dealing in stolen art. Instead, I found David Blackwood and learned about the most extraordinary cultural preservation effort I'd ever encountered." "Cultural preservation?" David was recovering stolen art, Marcus, pieces that had been taken from museums, looted from archaeological sites, stolen from private collections. He'd been tracking down lost cultural treasures for 40 years, and this, Harold gestured toward the vault doors, this was where he brought them for authentication, documentation, and eventual return to their rightful owners. Marcus stared at Harold, trying to process what he was hearing. "You're telling me there's stolen art behind those doors?" "I'm telling you there's recovered art behind those doors. Art that was stolen from its rightful owners, and that David spent decades tracking down and reclaiming. The difference might not seem important to you, but it's everything in terms of what you're inheriting." Harold stood and walked to the communication station, where he picked up a thick folder from among the electronic equipment. David documented everything, every piece, every acquisition, every plan for eventual return or preservation. He was more meticulous than most legitimate museums. Marcus took the folder with trembling hands and opened it to find photographs, certificates, and detailed provenance records for art pieces he couldn't even begin to evaluate. Paintings that looked like they belonged in the world's greatest museums. Sculptures that appeared to be ancient beyond imagination. Documents that seemed to trace the ownership of cultural treasures back through centuries. "How much are we talking about?" Marcus asked, his voice barely audible. "In monetary terms, impossible to say with precision. Some of these pieces are literally priceless artifacts that scholars thought were lost forever, artworks that have been missing for decades. But David never thought in terms of money. He thought in terms of cultural justice and historical preservation. Marcus closed the folder, feeling overwhelmed by the scope of what Harold was describing. "Why are you telling me this? Why didn't you just take control of everything when Blackwood died? Because legally, I have no authority here. When David died, this installation became part of the property that was sold to you. Everything behind those doors, everything in these tunnels, everything David spent 40 years accumulating it all, belongs to you now." The enormity of that statement hit Marcus like a physical blow. He was not just the owner of a castle anymore, he was the inheritor of a secret operation that dealt in recovered cultural treasures worth potentially hundreds of millions of dollars. "Harold, I can't handle something like this. I'm a construction worker with 3 kids. I don't know anything about art or cultural preservation or—" "David didn't know anything about those things when he started either," Harold interrupted. "But he learned, because he understood that someone had to try. Someone had to care about preserving human cultural heritage when institutions and governments couldn't or wouldn't act." Marcus sank into the chair Harold had offered earlier, feeling like the weight of centuries was pressing down on his shoulders. What did Blackwood want to happen to all of this? Harold pulled out another folder, this one marked with David Blackwood's careful handwriting. Succession planning. He hoped that whoever bought the castle would discover the collection and choose to continue his work. He established legal frameworks, funding mechanisms, and connections with scholars and institutions around the world. Everything you need to carry on his mission exists if you choose to accept it. "And if I don't?" Harold's expression grew grave. "Then one of the most important cultural preservation efforts in modern history dies with David Blackwood, and hundreds of irreplaceable artifacts remain hidden in a mountain until time and neglect destroy them." Marcus thought about his children sleeping peacefully above, unaware that their new home harbored secrets that could transform their lives or put them in danger. Who else knows about this? Besides you and me, David had contacts in the legitimate art world, people who helped with authentication and research. But the operation itself was known to very few people, and David was careful to keep it that way. "Why the secrecy?" Harold leaned forward, his expression intense. "Because the art world includes people who will kill to protect valuable collections, Marcus. Criminals who originally stole these pieces, collectors who bought them without asking questions, institutions that would rather see artifacts disappear than admit their provenance is questionable." David kept this secret because exposure could have been deadly. Marcus felt a chill of fear that had nothing to do with the cool air in the underground chamber. "Are you saying my family could be in danger?" "I'm saying that as long as this collection remains secret, you're probably safe, but if word gets out before you're prepared to handle the consequences, that could change very quickly." They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of Harold's revelations settling between them like a physical presence. Marcus thought about the impossible price he'd paid for the castle, about the architectural anomalies that had led him to these discoveries, about the choice he now faced between safety and significance. "Can I see it?" Marcus asked finally. "Whatever's behind those doors." Harold studied his face for a long time, as if evaluating whether Marcus was ready for what lay beyond the vault. Finally, he nodded and stood, walking to the electronic access panel beside the steel doors. David wanted whoever inherited this to see everything before making any decisions, Harold said, entering a complex code into the system. He believed that understanding the scope and importance of the collection was essential to making an informed choice about its future. The vault doors began to open with a deep mechanical hum that echoed through the stone chamber. As they swung apart, Marcus saw lights automatically activate beyond, illuminating a space that took his breath away. The room beyond the vault was enormous, carved from the living mountain and fitted with the most sophisticated preservation systems Marcus had ever imagined. Climate control, security monitoring, fire suppression, everything necessary to protect irreplaceable cultural treasures in an environment more controlled than most museums could provide. But it was the contents of the space that made Marcus understand, finally and completely, what Harold had been trying to tell him. Hundreds of objects filled the chamber. each one carefully displayed and documented, paintings that seemed to glow with their own inner light, sculptures that spoke of civilizations lost to time, ancient manuscripts preserved in transparent cases, religious artifacts that radiated spiritual significance even to someone with no training in such matters. This wasn't a storage, a facility, or even a warehouse. This was a sanctuary, a place where humanity's lost cultural heritage had been gathered and protected by one man's 40-year dedication to preserving what others had given up for lost. Marcus walked slowly through the chamber, stopping before displays that showcased treasures from every corner of the world and every period of human history. Each piece was accompanied by detailed documentation, provenance research, authentication certificates, and most importantly, plans for eventual return to rightful owners or appropriate institutions. He really intended to give it all back, Marcus said, his voice echoing in the vast space. Every piece, Harold confirmed. David's goal was never possession but preservation. He saw himself as a temporary guardian, someone who could protect these treasures until they could be returned to the light safely and appropriately. Marcus stopped before a display case containing what appeared to be ancient Greek pottery, their painted surfaces depicting scenes from mythology with breathtaking artistry. The accompanying documentation told a story of looting, illegal sale, and eventual recovery that spanned decades of patient investigation. How did he find them all? 40 years of careful detective work. David had contacts in law enforcement, academia, and yes, the less legitimate art world. He understood that recovering stolen cultural property required working with people who operated outside normal legal channels. As they moved deeper into the chamber, Marcus began to understand that what he was inheriting wasn't just a collection but a mission. Each piece represented not just an object of beauty or historical significance, but a story of cultural theft and eventual justice, of loss and recovery, of one man's belief that preserving human heritage was worth a lifetime of dedication. Near the center of the chamber, Harold stopped beside a particular display that seemed to hold special significance. The case contained what appeared to be religious artifacts, ornate chalices, ancient texts, ceremonial objects that spoke of faith and devotion across centuries. These pieces, Harold said quietly, belonged to Jewish communities destroyed during the Holocaust. David spent 15 years tracking them down, authenticating them, and establishing contact with surviving family members. Some of these objects are the only remaining connections those families have to ancestors they never knew. Marcus felt his throat tighten as he read the documentation accompanying the artifacts. Letters from families expressing gratitude for the return of treasures they thought were lost forever. Photographs of reunions between survivors and objects that carried their family's history. Thank you notes written in multiple languages, all expressing the same theme: wonder that someone had cared enough to preserve what others had tried to destroy. This is why David did it, Harold continued. Not for money or recognition, but for moments like these, for the chance to return stolen heritage to people who thought it was gone forever. They spent another hour moving through the chamber, with Harold explaining the history and significance of various sections of the collection. Ancient artifacts looted from archaeological sites, paintings stolen from European museums during World War II, religious treasures taken from churches and temples around the world. Each category represented years of research, negotiation, and careful recovery work. By the time they made their way back to the entrance, Marcus felt like he'd been given a condensed course in the darker side of cultural history, the theft, looting, and destruction that had scattered humanity's heritage across the globe, often into the hands of people who cared more about profit than preservation. But he'd also seen something more hopeful, evidence that individuals acting with purpose and dedication could make a difference, that stolen treasures could be recovered and returned, that cultural justice was possible even when traditional institutions couldn't provide it. Harold, Marcus said as they prepared to leave the chamber, what exactly are you asking me to do? The older man paused at the threshold, his hand resting on the control panel that would seal the vault behind them. "I'm asking you to continue David's work. The collection is documented, organized, and ready for distribution according to his plans. The legal framework exists to return pieces to their rightful owners or to institutions that can preserve them properly. What's needed is someone with the legal authority to implement those plans, someone like me, someone exactly like you, the person who owns the property where the collection is housed, who inherits both the responsibility and the authority to determine its fate." Marcus looked back at the chamber one last time, trying to absorb the magnitude of what he was being offered. Not just wealth, though the monetary value was staggering. Not just responsibility, though the cultural significance was overwhelming. But purpose, the chance to be part of something larger than his own survival, something that could honor human creativity and preserve it for future generations. As the vault doors sealed shut behind them, Marcus realized that his life had changed irrevocably the moment he'd crawled through that hidden passage. There was no going back to being just a struggling father trying to keep his family together. He was now the guardian of secrets that had been 40 years in the making, the inheritor of a mission that could define the rest of his life. The question was whether he had the courage to accept that responsibility, or whether the weight of it would crush him beneath its impossible demands. Marcus didn't sleep that night. He lay in his bed listening to the ancient stones of the castle settle around him, thinking about the vault hidden beneath his feet and the impossible responsibility Harold had placed on his shoulders. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those artifacts gleaming in their climate-controlled cases, each one representing decades of patient recovery work and stories of cultural theft that spanned centuries. But it was the letter tucked inside the succession planning folder that haunted him most. David Blackwood's final message to whoever would inherit his life's work, written in the careful handwriting of a man who knew his time was running out. To whoever discovers this collection, it had read, "I hope you understand that you now hold more than objects. You hold the dreams of artists who created beauty in the face of darkness, the faith of communities who treasured these pieces as connections to the divine, the memories of families who lost everything but hoped that somehow, someday, their heritage might return to the light." At dawn, Marcus found Harold in the kitchen, already tending the wood-burning stove and preparing coffee strong enough to wake the dead. The older man looked like he hadn't slept either, his weathered face drawn with exhaustion and something deeper, the weight of secrets he'd carried alone for too long. "The children?" Harold asked without preamble. "Still asleep. Yesterday wore them out." Marcus accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. "Harold, I need to see everything. All of it. I need to understand exactly what I'm dealing with before I make any decisions." Harold nodded, as if he'd been expecting this request. David would have wanted that. He believed that the magnitude of the collection was the only thing that could convey the importance of preserving it. "How much time do we have before the kids wake up?" "A few hours, if we're lucky. Emma's been sleeping later since the move, and Jake exhausted himself building that fort yesterday." Harold set down his coffee and pulled on his heavy winter coat. "But Marcus, what I'm about to show you, it's going to change how you see everything. There's no going back once you understand the full scope of what David accomplished." They made their way through Jake's closet and into the hidden passages in silence. Each man lost in his own thoughts about what lay ahead. The tunnels felt different in the pale light of Marcus's flashlight, now that he understood their purpose, not mysterious voids in the castle's architecture, but corridors designed to protect one of the most significant cultural preservation efforts in modern history. The great chamber looked even more impressive in daylight that filtered down through carefully concealed vents. Marcus could see details he'd missed the night before: the sophisticated air filtration systems, the seismic monitoring equipment, the backup power generators that ensured the preservation systems would function even during extended power outages. But it was what lay beyond the main vault that took his breath away. Harold led him through the passages that branched off from the central chamber, each one leading to specialized storage areas that housed different categories of recovered artifacts. The first was devoted entirely to ancient manuscripts and documents, thousands of pages of human knowledge preserved in temperature and humidity-controlled environments that would have impressed the Vatican's archivists, religious texts looted from monasteries during various wars. Harold explained as they moved through aisles of preservation cases, historical documents stolen from national archives, scientific treatises that were thought lost forever. David spent 15 years just cataloging what's in this section alone. Marcus stopped before a case containing what appeared to be illuminated medieval manuscripts, their gold leaf and vibrant colors undimmed by centuries. The accompanying documentation told stories of monastery libraries destroyed by invading armies, of monks who died protecting books they considered more valuable than their own lives, of texts that contained knowledge the world had thought lost forever. "What's the value of something like this?" Marcus asked, studying a manuscript that seemed to glow with its own inner light. "The Book of Kells sold for over $60 million at auction," Harold said quietly, "and that was a single volume. Some of these manuscripts are rarer, older, more significant to human cultural heritage." He paused. But David never thought in terms of auction values. He thought about returning these to institutions where scholars could study them, where they could contribute to human understanding instead of gathering dust in private collections. They moved deeper into the preservation complex, and Marcus began to understand that what he'd seen the previous night was merely the tip of an iceberg that extended far beyond his ability to comprehend. Chamber after chamber opened before them, each one housing artifacts from different cultures and historical periods, all meticulously documented and preserved. A section devoted to ancient Greek and Roman artifacts contained pottery, sculptures, and jewelry that belonged in the world's greatest museums. Another held Asian art spanning thousands of years, from delicate Chinese porcelain to massive Buddhist statues that must have weighed several tons each. A third chamber housed African tribal art, Native American ceremonial objects, and pre-Columbian artifacts that spoke of civilizations that had thrived long before European contact. "How did he acquire all of this?" Marcus asked, as they paused in a chamber devoted to Egyptian antiquities. Sarcophagi, canopic jars, and jewelry that had once adorned pharaohs filled the space with an atmosphere of ancient mystery and power. 40 years of patient detective work," Harold replied. David had contacts everywhere, law enforcement agents who specialized in art crimes, archaeologists who knew about illegal excavations, museum curators who suspected pieces in their collections had questionable provenance, even reformed art thieves who wanted to make amends for past crimes. Harold pulled out a thick folder from a filing cabinet that had been carved directly into the stone wall. This is just one example of how complex his operations were. A Monet painting stolen from a Jewish family in Paris during World War II. David traced it through 7 different owners over 60 years, each transaction more questionable than the last, before finally recovering it from a private collector who didn't know he'd bought stolen goods. Marcus read through the file, marveling at the level of research and documentation. Police reports, insurance claims, family photographs, authentication certificates, legal opinions, every piece of evidence needed to prove the painting's provenance and rightful ownership. The work represented years of investigation that would have challenged professional law enforcement agencies, and he returned it 2 years ago to the grandson of the original owner. The family had given up hope of ever seeing it again. Harold's voice carried deep satisfaction. They donated it to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, where it's displayed with the story of how it was recovered. David never took credit publicly, but he attended the dedication ceremony. Said it was the proudest moment of his life. They continued through chambers that seemed to extend endlessly into the mountain, each one revealing new categories of recovered cultural heritage. Medieval armor and weapons that had been looted from European castles, Islamic calligraphy and ceramics stolen from Middle Eastern museums during various conflicts, Impressionist paintings that had disappeared from private collections and been presumed lost forever. But it was in the final chamber that Marcus truly understood the magnitude of what he'd inherited. The space was enormous, larger than any of the others, and filled with artifacts that even his untrained eye could recognize as being of extraordinary value. Paintings by artists whose names were known to anyone who'd ever visited a museum. Sculptures that appeared to be Greek originals rather than Roman copies. Objects that radiated cultural significance like physical presence. "This is the crown jewel collection," Harold said quietly. "Pieces that are so valuable, so historically significant, that their theft made international news. David spent decades tracking them down, and some of them he only managed to recover in the last few years of his life." Marcus walked slowly through the chamber, stopping before displays that showcased treasures he recognized from documentaries and art history books. A Van Gogh that had been stolen from a museum in Amsterdam. Ancient gold artifacts looted from Mayan archaeological sites. Religious icons taken from Orthodox churches during the Russian Revolution. Each piece was accompanied by detailed documentation that told stories of cultural violence and eventual justice. But more importantly, each piece was accompanied by plans for repatriation, detailed instructions for how and when it should be returned to its rightful owners or appropriate cultural institutions. "Harold," Marcus said, his voice barely audible in the vast space, "what's the total value of everything we've seen?" The older man was quiet for a long moment, as if calculating figures that were almost too large to comprehend. Conservative estimates, based on recent auction prices for comparable pieces, put the collection's value at approximately $230 million. The number hit Marcus like a physical blow. $230 million. More money than he could have imagined in his wildest dreams, hidden beneath a castle he'd bought for $12,000. Enough wealth to transform his family's life beyond recognition, to ensure his children's futures, to solve every financial problem he'd ever faced. But as he looked around the chamber at artifacts that represented thousands of years of human cultural achievement, Marcus began to understand that the monetary value was almost irrelevant compared to the cultural significance of what he was looking at. "David could have been one of the wealthiest men in the world," he said finally. "He was one of the wealthiest men in the world," Harold corrected, "but not in the way most people measure wealth. He was rich in purpose, in the knowledge that he was preserving humanity's cultural heritage for future generations. Money was just a tool he used to accomplish his mission." They spent another hour in the chamber while Harold explained David Blackwood's background and the events that had shaped his extraordinary life's work. Born into a family that had made millions in railroad investments, David had inherited wealth, but not purpose, until a trip to Europe in the 1960s opened his eyes to the scope of cultural destruction that had occurred during World War II. He visited museums that were still trying to rebuild their collections decades after the war, Harold explained. He saw empty frames where stolen paintings had once hung, display cases that held nothing but index cards describing artifacts that had disappeared. He met Holocaust survivors who showed him family photographs of treasures that had been looted by Nazi soldiers and never recovered. That experience had changed David's life completely. Instead of living as a wealthy dilettante, he dedicated himself to tracking down and recovering stolen cultural property, using his inheritance to fund investigations that could take years to complete and acquisitions that often required delicate negotiations with people who operated outside legal boundaries. The underground complex took him 20 years to excavate and outfit, Harold continued. He worked with mining engineers to ensure the chambers were stable, with preservation specialists to design climate control systems, with security experts to create monitoring systems that would protect the collection from theft or damage. Marcus tried to imagine the dedication required for such an undertaking. 20 years of construction and planning, followed by another 20 years of systematic recovery work. A lifetime devoted to preserving cultural heritage that most people didn't even know was missing. Why didn't he work with official institutions, museums, government agencies, international organizations. Harold's expression grew sad. He tried, early on. But he discovered that legitimate institutions often couldn't act on information about stolen art, either because of diplomatic concerns, legal complications, or simple bureaucratic inertia. Pieces that everyone knew were stolen could remain in private collections for decades while officials debated jurisdiction and proper procedures. They were standing before a display case containing ancient Cambodian sculptures that had been looted from Angkor Wat during the Civil War years. The documentation showed a trail of ownership that led through black market dealers, corrupt officials, and private collectors who claimed ignorance about the artifact's origins. These pieces were stolen from one of humanity's greatest archaeological sites, Harold said. David tracked them down over 15 years, working with Cambodian officials, Interpol agents, and reformed smugglers who provided information about trafficking networks. If he'd waited for official channels to act, these sculptures would still be decorating some billionaire's mansion instead of waiting to be returned to the Cambodian people. As they made their way back through the complex toward the castle, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. He wasn't just the owner of valuable art anymore, he was the guardian of cultural justice, the inheritor of a mission that could define the rest of his life. But the practical implications were overwhelming. How could a construction worker from upstate New York possibly continue work that had challenged an educated, wealthy, and well-connected man like David Blackwood? How could he navigate the complex world of international cultural property law, museum politics, and art authentication? Most importantly, how could he protect his children while taking on responsibilities that David had warned could be dangerous? "Harold," Marcus said as they emerged into Jake's closet, "I need you to be completely honest with me. If I agree to continue David's work, what kind of risks are we talking about? Not just legal risks, but physical risks to my family." The older man paused in the act of closing the hidden panel, his expression grave. David received death threats over the years. People who had acquired pieces illegally didn't appreciate having their ownership challenged. There were break-in attempts, surveillance, even an incident where someone tried to intimidate him by vandalizing his cottage. Marcus felt his blood turn cold. "And you think those same people might come after me? I think that as long as you keep the collection secret and continue David's policy of discreet repatriation, you'll probably be safe. The people who have the most to fear from exposure are also the ones with the most to lose if they act violently against you." Harold's voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent decades in law enforcement. "But if word gets out publicly before you're prepared to handle media attention and legal challenges, that could change the situation significantly." They climbed the stairs to Marcus's bedroom in silence, each man lost in thoughts about the impossible choice that lay ahead. In his room, Marcus sat on the edge of his bed and stared out the window at snow-covered mountains that hid one of the world's most significant cultural preservation efforts. His children would be waking soon, expecting breakfast and attention, and the kind of normal family life they'd been rebuilding since Sarah's death. They had no idea that their father was contemplating a decision that could transform their existence completely, either lifting them into a life of purpose and significance, or exposing them to dangers they couldn't understand or defend against. "What would you do, Harold? If you were in my position, with 3 children to protect, what would you do?" Harold sat in the chair by Marcus's window, looking every one of his 70-plus years. "I'd remember that David Blackwood was once in exactly your position. He inherited wealth he didn't earn and had to decide what to do with it. He chose to use it for something larger than himself, and in the process, he preserved cultural heritage that would have been lost forever. But he didn't have children depending on him. No, he didn't. But Marcus, your children are going to grow up either way. The question is whether they grow up understanding that their father was offered the chance to do something important and chose safety over significance, or whether they grow up knowing that when their father was given the opportunity to preserve human cultural heritage, he found the courage to accept that responsibility. Marcus thought about Emma, who had always loved stories about heroes and quests and people who discovered they were capable of more than they'd ever imagined. He thought about Jake, whose curiosity and intelligence could flourish in an environment where discovery and learning were daily realities. He thought about Lily, who deserved to grow up in a world where beautiful things were protected rather than exploited. Most of all, he thought about Sarah, who had always believed that individuals could make a difference if they were willing to try, who had taught their children to care about justice and beauty and the preservation of what was valuable in human culture. "There's something else you should know," Harold said quietly. "David established a foundation to support the preservation work. Legal ownership of the collection transfers to whoever owns the castle, but the foundation provides funding for authentication, conservation, legal research, and repatriation efforts. You wouldn't be doing this work alone or without resources." Marcus looked up sharply. "What kind of resources?" "Enough to maintain the preservation systems, hire experts when needed, travel to research provenance or negotiate returns, and support your family comfortably while you're learning to manage the collection." Harold pulled out another folder. David was meticulous about ensuring that whoever inherited his work would have the tools necessary to continue it successfully. For the first time since discovering the underground complex, Marcus began to see a path forward that didn't involve choosing between his children's safety and cultural preservation. With proper support and careful planning, it might be possible to continue David's work while protecting his family from the risks involved. But it would mean accepting a level of responsibility he'd never imagined, committing to work that would consume years of his life, and trusting that he could learn to navigate a world far removed from anything in his previous experience. Marcus stood and walked to his window, looking out over the 14 acres of mountain wilderness that had come with his impossible purchase. In the distance, morning light was beginning to illuminate peaks that seemed to stretch toward infinity, suggesting possibilities as vast and challenging as the choice he now faced. His children's voices drifted up from the kitchen below, where they were probably discovering that Harold had left fresh bread and preserves for their breakfast. Normal sounds of a normal morning in their new life, unaware that their father was contemplating a decision that would determine whether that new life remained simple and safe or became extraordinary and meaningful. Marcus thought about the artifacts he'd seen, about families who had waited decades to be reunited with their cultural heritage, about communities whose treasures had been returned through David Blackwood's patient work. He thought about the knowledge that would be lost if the collection remained hidden, the injustices that would go unredressed if no one continued the mission of cultural preservation. But mostly he thought about the man he wanted to be for his children, the example he wanted to set about courage and purpose, and the importance of saying yes when life offered opportunities to do something that mattered. "Harold," Marcus said, turning away from the window, "what do I need to do first?" The relief in the older man's face was immediate and profound. "The first step is the hardest one, deciding to try. Everything else is just details we can figure out together." Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of fear and a strengthening of resolve that reminded him of the moment he'd first seen the castle, and knew he had to have it, regardless of how impossible it seemed. He was going to continue David Blackwood's work. He was going to learn to be the guardian of cultural heritage worth $230 million. He was going to give his children the opportunity to grow up understanding that their lives had purpose beyond survival, that their family was part of something larger and more significant than they'd ever imagined. It was terrifying and overwhelming, and completely beyond his qualifications. It was also the most important decision he'd ever made. "Harold," Marcus said, his voice steady with newfound determination, "tell me everything I need to know." Outside his window, snow continued to fall over the mountains that harbored one of the world's most significant cultural preservation efforts. Inside the castle, 3 children began another day in their impossible new home, unaware that their father had just accepted responsibility for protecting humanity's cultural heritage. And in the depths of the mountain, $230 million worth of recovered art waited patiently for the next chapter in their long journey back to the light. safe in the knowledge that they had found a new guardian willing to continue the work of ensuring that beautiful things, once lost, could be found again. The broken-hearted widower who had bought a castle to save his family had discovered that sometimes salvation came not from escaping responsibility, but from embracing it. Not from playing it safe, but from having the courage to accept purposes larger than personal survival. Marcus Hartwell was no longer just a father trying to rebuild his life after tragedy. He was the inheritor of David Blackwood's mission, the guardian of cultural justice, and the protector of treasures that belong to all humanity. And for the first time since Sarah's death, he felt like the man he was meant to be. Spring came too, the mountains like a whispered promise, melting snow into streams that sang through the valleys and coaxing wildflowers from soil that had been frozen for months. Marcus stood at the kitchen window of the castle, watching his children play in the morning sunshine, and marveled at how completely their lives had transformed since that desperate December day when he'd first driven up the mountain road. 6 months had passed since he'd accepted responsibility for David Blackwood's collection, and the scared, grieving father who had bought a castle with his last savings had evolved into something he never thought possible, a man with purpose, confidence, and the daily satisfaction of work that mattered to the world. The children had adapted to their new reality with the resilience that seemed built into young hearts. Emma had become his unofficial research assistant, her love of stories and natural curiosity making her invaluable when it came to investigating the provenance of recovered artifacts. She spent hours in the castle's library, now expanded with David's extensive collection of art history books, tracing the journeys of stolen treasures and helping Marcus understand the cultural contexts that made their return so significant. Jake had appointed himself the castle's chief of security, taking seriously his role in protecting what he'd learned were important things that belonged to people who lost them. His natural curiosity about hidden passages had expanded into a genuine understanding of the preservation systems that kept the collection safe, and Harold had begun teaching him the basics of climate control and monitoring equipment. Lily had become the collection's emotional guardian, insisting on daily visits to what she called the treasure rooms to ensure that everything was happy and safe. Her 6-year-old perspective had proven surprisingly valuable. She had an instinct for which pieces needed special attention and an uncanny ability to sense when environmental conditions weren't quite right. But it was Marcus himself who had changed most dramatically. The broken man who had struggled to get through each day without Sarah had found something he'd lost the day she died, a sense that his life had meaning beyond survival, that his choices could make a difference in the world. The first successful repatriation had happened 3 months after Marcus accepted his role as trustee. A collection of Cambodian sculptures stolen from Angkor Wat during the Civil War years had been returned to the Cambodian government in a ceremony that brought tears to the eyes of everyone involved. Marcus had traveled to Washington for the handover, accompanied by Emma, who had helped research the piece's original locations within the temple complex. Watching Cambodian officials weep with joy as they were reunited with treasures they'd thought lost forever, Marcus had understood for the first time what David Blackwood must have felt during 40 years of this work. It wasn't about the monetary value of the artifacts or the recognition that came from their return. It was about justice, about healing cultural wounds, about proving that beautiful things stolen in darkness could still find their way back to the light. The sculptures will go on display in the National Museum in Phnom Penh. The Cambodian cultural attaché had told Marcus after the ceremony. Schoolchildren will learn about their heritage, scholars will study their artistic techniques, and our people will remember that even when everything seems lost, there are those who never stop looking for ways to bring it home. Emma had squeezed Marcus's hand during that conversation, and he'd seen in her eyes the same understanding that was growing in his own heart. They were part of something larger than themselves, something that honored the best impulses of human nature rather than the worst. The legal aspects of managing the collection had proven less daunting than Marcus had initially feared. David's preparation had been extraordinarily thorough, creating frameworks that allowed for systematic repatriation while protecting both the artifacts and the people working to return them. A team of lawyers specializing in cultural property law had been established years earlier. Their fees paid by the foundation David had created to support the preservation work. "Your role is more like that of a museum director than a traditional collector," explained Patricia Chen, the lead attorney who had worked with David for over a decade. "You have legal title to the pieces, but your responsibility is to facilitate their eventual return to appropriate institutions or communities according to the protocols David established." The foundation provided not just legal support, but also funding for authentication experts, conservation specialists, and the researchers needed to verify provenance and identify rightful ownership. Marcus had been amazed to discover that David's network of contacts included some of the world's most respected experts in various fields of art and archaeology, all of whom had volunteered to continue supporting the repatriation efforts. Dr. Sarah Martinez from the Metropolitan Museum had become a regular visitor to the castle, helping Marcus understand the broader context of cultural preservation and recovery work. What David accomplished here represents the most significant private effort to address art theft and cultural looting in modern history, she'd told him during one of her research visits. The documentation alone is worth millions of dollars to the scholarly community, but the actual recovery and preservation work is literally priceless. The impact on their small mountain community had been gradual but profound. Word had spread carefully through the network of people Harold trusted, and Marcus had found himself welcoming visitors who came not as tourists but as pilgrims to what was becoming recognized as one of the world's most important centers for cultural preservation education. A group of college students studying art history had been the first to visit officially, arriving for a weekend seminar on provenance research and cultural property law. Marcus had watched his children interact with young adults who shared their growing passion for protecting cultural heritage, and he'd seen how naturally Emma, Jake, and Lily had stepped into roles as junior educators, sharing their knowledge of the collection and its significance with infectious enthusiasm. The local community had embraced the castle's new purpose with surprising warmth. The small town, at the base of the mountain, which had struggled economically for decades, was experiencing a renaissance as visiting scholars, legal researchers, and cultural officials brought new business to local hotels, restaurants, and shops. "You've given us something to be proud of," the mayor had told Marcus during a town council meeting where plans for expanded visitor facilities were being discussed. For years, people drove through here without stopping. Now they come specifically to learn about the important work being done at the castle. "We're not just a place people pass through anymore, we're a destination." But the transformation that mattered most to Marcus was the one happening within his own family. His children were growing up understanding that they were part of something significant, that their lives had purpose beyond personal happiness or material success. They were learning about cultures and histories from around the world through direct contact with artifacts that had shaped human civilization for thousands of years. Emma had begun writing about their experiences, creating stories that combined her love of fantasy with real-world knowledge about cultural preservation. Her notebooks were filled with tales of brave scholars who rescued lost treasures and returned them to grateful communities, stories that Harold said reminded him of the kind of myths that grew up around heroes in ancient cultures. Jake had developed an almost mystical understanding of the castle's hidden architecture, able to navigate the secret passages and underground chambers with confidence that impressed even Harold. More importantly, he'd begun to see himself as a protector of important things, a role that gave him confidence and purpose that extended far beyond his knowledge of the collection. Lily had appointed herself the castle's emotional center, the one who remembered to thank the artifacts for sharing their stories and who insisted on celebrating successful repatriations with special dinners that honored the cultures to which pieces were being returned. Her innocent perspective often provided insights that more sophisticated analysis missed, and visiting experts had learned to pay attention when she declared that certain pieces wanted to go home. The work itself had settled into rhythms that felt natural rather than overwhelming. Marcus's days were filled with correspondence with museums and cultural institutions around the world, research into the histories of individual pieces, and coordination of authentication and conservation efforts. It was challenging work that required constant learning, but it was also deeply satisfying in ways that construction jobs had never been. The castle had been transformed as well, with David's hidden preservation chambers now serving as research facilities where visiting scholars could examine artifacts while determining their optimal destinations. The main floors of the building had been converted into a combination of family living space and educational center, where small groups could learn about cultural preservation while experiencing the collection firsthand. One afternoon in late spring, Marcus found himself in the library with Dr. Martinez, reviewing plans for the return of a collection of Jewish ceremonial objects that had been stolen during the Holocaust. The pieces were being returned to families in 3 different countries, reunions that had taken years to arrange but promised to heal wounds that had festered for decades. The Goldstein family in New York hasn't seen their grandfather's Torah crown since 1942, Dr. Martinez explained, showing Marcus photographs of the family members who would receive the artifact. They thought everything from their synagogue had been destroyed. Learning that someone preserved this piece, protected it, documented its history, it's given them back a connection to ancestors they never thought they'd honor again. Marcus studied the photographs, seeing faces that reflected joy, amazement, and something deeper, the healing that came from recovering pieces of identity that had seemed lost forever. It was the same expression he'd seen on the faces of Cambodian officials when their sculptures were returned. The same wonder that appeared in the eyes of Native American tribal leaders when sacred objects found their way back to their original communities. "How do you measure the value of something like that?" he asked Dr. Martinez. "You don't," she replied simply. That's why David's work was so important. He understood that some things can't be quantified in monetary terms but are still priceless to the people who created them and the communities that treasure them. As summer approached, Marcus began planning the first annual conference that would be held at the castle, bringing together experts in cultural preservation, law enforcement officials who specialized in art crimes, and representatives from communities working to recover their stolen heritage. The event would honor David Blackwood's legacy while establishing the castle as a permanent center for cultural preservation education. "Dad," Emma said one evening as they planned the conference agenda, "do you think Mom would be proud of what we're doing?" The question caught Marcus off guard, not because it was difficult, but because he knew the answer with absolute certainty. Sarah would have loved everything about their new life, the purpose that drove their days, the connections they were building with people from around the world, the way their children were learning to see themselves as protectors of beautiful and important things. "I think she would be amazed," Marcus told his daughter. She always believed that ordinary people could do extraordinary things if they were willing to try. "I think she'd say we're proving her right." That night, Marcus walked through the castle's great halls and underground chambers, marveling at how completely his life had changed since that desperate winter day when he'd bought an impossible home with his last dollars. The scared, grieving father, who had struggled to keep his family together, had become someone he'd never imagined. The guardian of cultural justice, the protector of humanity's artistic heritage, the head of a family that understood its purpose in the world. The collection was smaller now than it had been when he'd inherited it. Dozens of pieces had been returned to their rightful owners or appropriate institutions, each repatriation representing justice served and cultural wounds healed. But the reduction in size had been matched by an increase in meaning. Every remaining piece was there for a reason, waiting for the right moment and the right destination to complete its journey home. Standing in the chamber that housed the most significant remaining artifacts, Marcus thought about the path that had brought him to this moment. Sarah's death had shattered his world, leaving him desperate and directionless, grasping for any possibility that might save his family from complete collapse. The castle had seemed like a last desperate gamble, an impossible dream purchased with money he couldn't afford to spend. But sometimes the most desperate gambles led to the most extraordinary discoveries. Sometimes darkest moments of life were followed by purposes so profound that they transformed not just individual families, but entire communities. Sometimes the things that seemed too good to be true turned out to be exactly what the world needed most. Marcus thought about David Blackwood, who had spent 40 years creating the infrastructure that now supported the castle's mission. A man who could have lived comfortably on inherited wealth, but chose instead to dedicate his life to preserving cultural heritage that would otherwise have been lost forever. David had understood something that Marcus was only beginning to grasp, that real wealth came not from possessing beautiful things but from ensuring they found their way to where they belonged. The next morning brought news that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. A major museum in Europe was requesting assistance in verifying the provenance of pieces in their collection, suspicious that some of their most prized holdings might have questionable histories. The request represented a new phase in the castle's mission, moving beyond the return of obviously stolen pieces to helping legitimate institutions ensure the ethical integrity of their collections. "This is what David always hoped for," Harold explained as they reviewed the museum's request. Not just returning stolen art, but creating standards and practices that would prevent future theft and ensure that cultural preservation happened ethically. Marcus felt the weight of that responsibility settling on his shoulders, but it was a comfortable weight now, familiar and manageable. He'd grown into his role as David's successor, developed confidence in his ability to navigate complex cultural and legal issues, and built relationships with experts around the world who supported the castle's mission. More importantly, he'd learned that accepting responsibility for something larger than himself hadn't diminished his ability to be a good father to his children. If anything, it had enhanced his parenting, giving Emma, Jake, and Lily examples of how individual choices could make a difference in the world, how work could be meaningful rather than simply necessary, how families could serve purposes that extended far beyond their own needs. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, Marcus stood with his children on the castle's front steps, welcoming delegates to the first annual Cultural Preservation Conference. Representatives from museums, law enforcement agencies, tribal governments, and educational institutions had traveled from around the world to participate in 3 days of sessions focused on developing new approaches to protecting and recovering cultural heritage. Emma served as the conference's youth coordinator, helping visiting students understand the significance of the work being done at the castle. Jake led tours of the preservation facilities, his knowledge of the underground chambers and security systems impressing professional archaeologists and museum curators. Lily had prepared a special presentation about why protecting beautiful things was important work for everyone, her 6-year-old perspective providing insights that complemented the more technical sessions. During the conference's opening ceremony, Marcus found himself standing before an audience that included some of the world's most respected experts in cultural preservation, law enforcement, and international relations. A year earlier, he would have been terrified by such responsibility. Now, he felt honored to carry on David Blackwood's work and confident in his ability to contribute meaningfully to efforts that spanned continents and cultures. David Blackwood understood something that the rest of us are still learning, Marcus told the assembly. Cultural heritage doesn't belong to any individual person or institution. It belongs to humanity itself, and those of us privileged to serve as temporary guardians must always remember that our goal is preservation and eventual return, not possession. He gestured toward his children, who sat in the front row wearing expressions of pride and understanding that would have amazed the broken father who'd first brought them to this mountain castle. The next generation will inherit the work we're doing here. Our job is to give them the tools and knowledge they need to continue protecting humanity's cultural heritage for generations we'll never see. The applause that followed wasn't just recognition of his words, but acknowledgement of what the castle had become under his stewardship, a beacon for cultural preservation efforts around the world. A place where stolen treasures could be returned to their rightful owners, and a center for training the next generation of people dedicated to protecting what was beautiful and important in human civilization. That evening, after the conference delegates had retired to their accommodations in the renovated sections of the castle, Marcus sat alone in David's study, reading through correspondence from families and communities whose cultural heritage had been returned through the castle's efforts. Letters of gratitude written in dozens of languages, all expressing the same theme: wonder that someone had cared enough to preserve what others had tried to destroy or steal. One letter, from a young woman whose grandmother's jewelry had been returned after being stolen 60 years earlier, particularly moved him. "You gave us back more than objects. You gave us back the stories that connect us to who we are, the tangible proof that our ancestors' lives mattered enough to be preserved and protected. Thank you for understanding that some things are too precious to remain lost." Marcus folded the letter carefully and placed it in the growing file of gratitude that had become one of his most treasured possessions. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: authentication requests from museums, repatriation negotiations with government officials, educational sessions with visiting scholars. But tonight, he allowed himself to feel the deep satisfaction that came from work that mattered, from responsibilities that honored rather than diminished the human spirit. He thought about Sarah, who had always believed that individuals could make a difference if they were willing to try. She would have loved the life they'd built in this impossible castle. The way their children were growing up, understanding that protection of beautiful things was work worth doing. The connections they'd forged with people around the world who shared their commitment to cultural preservation. Most of all, she would have been proud of the man Marcus had become, no longer the scared, desperate father who'd bought a castle with his last dollars, but someone who'd found the courage to accept purposes larger than personal survival, someone who'd learned that the most valuable treasures were often discovered during the darkest moments of life. The castle slept around him, its ancient stones holding secrets that were no longer hidden but shared with the world, its chambers filled with artifacts, waiting patiently for their own journeys home. And in the silence, Marcus felt the deep peace that came from knowing that his life had meaning beyond his own happiness, that his family was part of something significant and lasting, and that sometimes the most desperate gambles led to the most extraordinary transformations. Anyone can change their life if they're brave enough to say yes to opportunities that seem impossible, wise enough to accept help when it's offered, and committed enough to work that serves something larger than personal survival. As the morning sun warmed the ancient stones of the castle that had become their sanctuary and mission, Marcus Hartwell didn't reach for job listings or overdue bills. He reached for letters from museums around the world, correspondence from families seeking lost heritage, and the research documents that would guide another day of returning cultural treasures to where they belonged. The broken-hearted father, who had bought a castle for $12,000, had become the guardian of one of the most significant cultural preservation efforts in modern history. Because sometimes the most desperate gambles don't just save us, they give us the chance to save something infinitely more valuable. For Marcus, and for the hundreds of families whose cultural heritage he was helping to recover, home wasn't just a place to live. It was a place where lost things could be found, where stolen treasures could be returned, and where ordinary people could do extraordinary work that would echo through history. Because the greatest treasures in life aren't the ones we find in moments of joy and abundance. They're the ones we discover in our darkest hours, when grief and desperation force us to take chances we never thought we'd be brave enough to accept. And sometimes, if we're very lucky and very willing, those chances transform not just our own lives, but the lives of countless others whose stories become forever connected to our own. Up next, 2 more incredible true stories are waiting for you. Click now to continue the journey, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe some discoveries are worth more than money, they're worth everything.